And welcome to the next edition of the Value Exchange podcast. I'm Annabelle Lambert and I'm with my regular co-host Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
You've had your hair cut, Annabelle.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Moving on, I am delighted today to be joined by Mr. Richard Dennis, who has been part of the Ethos community network for a very long time, early days of Team Army, I believe. And Richard is a trustee of the Team Army Foundation, Sports Foundation, for a very long time. He served. I'll let him tell us how long he served in the army, but more recently, since leaving, has been working non-exec strategy for various organisations, but also has some wonderful stories of social value that he's been working on with those organisations and with others. So, Richard, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what you are about.
Well, Annabelle, thank you. I mean, first of all, it was heartening, if not a little unsettling, to be reminded how long I've been involved with Ethos for. So what can I say? So I spent the first part of my professional life as a soldier, and I'm of that generation which began life pounding the streets of Northern Ireland, moved on to the Falklands, the Balkans, subsequently the first Gulf War, and finished up in Afghanistan. And since leaving the army, I've been motivated by two things. To do things which will continue in some small way to make the world a slightly better place, which I know that I can do well, because then I hope that people will benefit from them, and I will enjoy doing them. And secondly, and no less importantly, to only do those things with people that I genuinely want to work with. And I'm delighted under that heading to be back in the Ethos fold, as it were, for at least for the length of this video.
Making a mad exit for the door.
So you're not just a soldier, not just a retired soldier, but a family man as well. Your family are a big part of your life. Just paint a picture of the family side of it.
Yeah, certainly. Yes. Well, I mean, I thought the least I could do was to play my part in recruiting for the army by generating as many sons as I could. So Susie and I have 4 boys, but sadly, none of them was daft enough to follow me into the army. They're all pursuing independent careers. Although interestingly, one of them very much on the cutting edge of a lot of what I think we might touch on today, which is making the world a better place. He's a sustainability director in a big privately owned business. He's just taken them through B Corp certification. So very much espouses the values that I think some of which we're going to begin to unpack today.
So before we get on to life after the army, I just wanted to, and you'll probably hate me for this, and this is not prepared. This is none of our questions are pre-prompted, but take you back to to sport, to skiing, to well-being through physical activity and sport, which I know you're completely passionate about. And we met, I believe, before your last tour in the army, and it was in army winter sports. So if you could just paint a picture of the role of physical activity and sport in the services, in the army in particular. We met, I think, in Chevalier originally, to the Army Winter Sports Championships, which happen every year. But the role of sport in your career and its role in terms of well-being for employees of the armed services. So just where did that come from in your case?
Well, I mean, first of all, in the army, we recognise, as they do in the other services, that sport, adventure, challenge has an enormous part to play in a number of the key components of military capability. first and foremost, it's actually delivering on the promise that we make to young men and young women: join the army, see the world, get the opportunity to play sport, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, it brings out in people, it develops people's character, it gets them used to working in teams, it puts them under pressure, particularly under the adventurous heading and the sort of things that I was responsible for with Army Winter Sports. It actually simulates some of that stress, that very rapid decision making, that sheer sense of, crikey, I'm being asked to do something here which I've never done before, and I really don't believe that I can do. But because you're part of a team, you can and you do, and that translates very readily into the battlefield, where we need people to behave in exactly the same way. For me, sport has always been an enormous part of my life. I was a rugby player growing up. I continued to play rugby and hockey, and then I skied for the army, and so on and so forth. So I've been very fortunate to have had sport woven throughout my professional as well as my personal life, all of my life, and I genuinely see that as being an enormous privilege.
So the first project we collaborated on, and Annabelle has just reminded us just how long we've known each other, but I think it must be 15 years or so ago, in a venture that was initially called Team Army. It became a charity. You were one of the original and still are trustee of that charity. It's now the Team Forces Foundation. It's very much a tri-service endeavour. But we recognised, and it's a sort of military and me with a civilian hat on, the opportunity for businesses to play a big role in supporting social value, just as you've said, sport, challenge, adventure. And we worked together with a team of people who were serving, who were outside, to set up a fundraising organisation. And I think, Annabelle, is it 12 million? You remind us that.
Yes, 12 million. 12 million. Yeah.
Lamont and his team have made through that. And that was just a few people with an idea. And any memories of that? Any recollection of where that came from, why it's so important, your role, what attracted you into that, the part you've played?
Yeah, very much so. And it's a story which I find myself retelling regularly at Team Forces events to new members of the gang. I mean, you might remember, Rob, that it was brought about because sport, challenge, and adventure it's an expensive business, and in particular, putting soldiers, which was my responsibility, into the Alps for climbing, for ice sports, for downhill skiing, and so on and so forth, to develop all those qualities that I spoke about a moment ago. It's an expensive hobby, and our ability to do that was fluctuating year on year, depending on whether or not we managed to attract industry sponsors who wanted to be associated with what we were doing and how we were doing it. And with your help, we developed a vision which saw defence businesses subscribing to Team Army, and in return for that, being given the opportunity to attend events, sporting events that we would curate, at which we could guarantee attendance of senior military decision makers, so that all-important networking activity between industry leaders and military leaders could take place in the context of military sport. And the trick was that passed all the regulatory and proprietary hurdles, such as the Bribery Act and so on and so forth, because it was military sport and not Wimbledon, Twickenham, or whatever it might be. And as you've said, that was longer ago than I care to think, certainly 12 or 14 years ago. And here we are now, having broadened the offer to all three services, having very deliberately moved away purely from sport into the world of challenge and adventure. For example, we sponsored Polar Preet Chandy, Captain Preet Chandy, who broke 2 Guinness World Records earlier this year, being the first woman of colour to reach the South Pole, and then subsequently to mount a second expedition in the same calendar year to attempt to traverse the Antarctic. We were directly responsible for raising the sponsorship she needed for that. We were the key sponsors for Harry Magda, Corporal Harry Magda, who has just recently summited Everest, the first double amputee to achieve that, above the knee amputee. The story goes on. So £12 million dispersed into service, sport and adventure, and I'm enormously proud of the part that I've had to play in that and continue to play, as you mentioned, Rob.
Yeah, I think we all are. A very special project, and it is about those moments, those stories. So, you're the first transitioned military guest we've had on the show. So now, before we move into current life, I'd like you to just talk a little bit about the transition from a full career, in service, to civilian land, to your it's not a particularly comfortable journey from your own identity. My experience, not with you, but just in talking to people, that people find it quite a wrench to, you've had one life and you're now going to a very different one. How was that transition from your personal perspective? How was that as a story?
It's been a success story, and it's been a story which I very much enjoy being at the centre of, together with Susie and the boys. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, I never saw the army as being the sole definition for me as an individual. Sport was part of that. Wherever I've been, I've made the opportunity to play not only for service teams, but for civilian teams, so that we've always had a very rich fabric of friends in the civilian community as well as the military community. We have been, I was fortunate enough, shortly after I completed my senior staff training, I was offered the opportunity to do an MBA by the Army. So having a professional business qualification for the last 12 or 15 years of my service was enormously helpful, because I was beginning to see the business side of soldiering through a completely different pair of eyes. And then while I was commanding my brigade up in York in 2007, I was approached by one of the employers that I worked with very closely for generating reserve manpower and asked to join the board of their company. And I spent 7 years as a non-executive director of an engineering business while I was still serving, with the MOD's blessing. So by the time I came to leave, it was the next natural step for me. And it was one which I was ready for. It was one which I put a lot of thought and preparation into. But that thought and preparation had begun many years before. So for me, it was a pretty seamless transition. And when I look back on 8 years of running my own business, it's been a great success. And I don't think that there are very few things that I would have done differently. And people say to me now, don't you miss the army? And the answer to that is always no, I don't. Because the most important part of the army was the people, and I'm still in touch with all of them. So, so the difference is that I'm standing here in a pair of Levi's as opposed to a pair of camouflage trousers, I guess. But life is no less satisfying. In fact, in many ways, it's more satisfying.
So, thank you for the insights. I think to underscore a couple of bits that you said, and then we're going to move on to life after, the main event, almost the main story. But the to not derive one's identity from one's role, in my words, not your, is so important. We are first people, and we're all the very rich and complicated things about, that comes with one life and, one's perspective on life. And then second, we happen to occupy roles, whether that's a brigadier or non-exec director or father or friend or whatever. But the idea of promoting social value and accelerating is that comes from a perspective, a point of view of being first an individual, a person, a whole, rather than a role. So I now want to sort of move forward to sort of life after the service, and which almost sounds like a sort of a post-mortem or a reincarnation, doesn't it? But in terms of how you found the people, the social value and the nature value of the sort of work that you're doing now, where, that sort of, obviously not a sudden epiphany or uncovering, but just the sort of opportunities you've had to get involved in work around social value or environmental regeneration, some of the stories that you've shared recently with us. Just take us from retire, when you stepped out of service to now, and some of the moments for you in that.
Yes, I mean, some of them are quite unusual. They are social value and community benefit seen through some very unique lenses. The first thing to say is that I originally thought I would go into something full-time when I left the army. I'd never known anything else, so it was a natural assumption to make. And I was promoting myself as a chief operating officer. I've been chief of staff of a brigade, I've been chief of staff of a division in the army, I have that MBA, I had, more importantly perhaps, more than 7 years of practical experience as a non-executive director. So I felt that I had something to offer a business that needed somebody to act in that chief operating officer, that chief of staff role, acting as the eyes and ears and the confidant of a chief exec, and orchestrating the day-to-day running of a complex business. And from my point of view, the more complex, the better. However, fate didn't quite see it the same way, because even before I left, I was asked if I would go out and do some work in Nigeria, and superficially, the requirement was to present a solution to the Nigerian government, which was designed to reduce the incidence of crude oil theft in the Niger Delta, which costs their economy billions of dollars a year. And the offering that I was presented with, which I was invited to put a strategic wrap around, I think was the phrase that I was given, was very, it was very binary. It was very, we can put a meter on your wellhead, we can weigh the unladen weight of your tankers before they leave the depot, and so on and so forth. And what struck me was that nobody had taken the time and trouble to take two paces back and ask why this was happening in the first place. And it was abject poverty amongst the communities in the Niger Delta. This was not big business siphoning off the majority of this. It was dirt poor communities who relied on this as some means of revenue. So what? So my mind began to think along the lines of how much more successful would this be if, instead of worrying about metering the wellhead, you actually got those communities into a place where it was in their interest to stop the loss of crude oil. And there was actually a gain share arrangement put in place whereby that community would see a direct beneficial impact on reducing the incidence of crude oil theft, by which I had in mind simple things such as guaranteed clean water being introduced into the community, a community centre, a school, and so on and so forth. Those sort of things that we've all seen, some of us have done on our gap years, and so on and so forth. They're done for a reason, because they do actually confer some benefit on the community. And that approach, first and foremost, made an awful lot of people sit up and think, crikey, hadn't even thought of that.
Richard, can I ask sort of where do you think that came from? Because I, as you say, there are a lot of people who just don't and never think about that. They look at the problem and go, right, let's solve the problem. But actually, the problem quite often is an upstream problem. It's how do we stop this happening? By something as you just described, nobody'd ever thought of. Where do you think that came from in you? Why did you have that thought? Or what?
I was given the gift of empathy very early on in my professional development. I took my first rifle platoon onto the streets of Londonderry in February 1979. I was 19 years old, and I had the responsibility of 24 curious soldiers, the lives of 24 curious soldiers, curious because they wanted to see what I was going to do next. And
Wow.
but before we went onto the streets, I was lucky enough to have a company commander, my direct boss, who was what I would describe as a soldier scholar. He was a thinker, and he encouraged the three of us, the three young officers in his company, to read a book by an American author you may be familiar with, called Leon Uris. And the book was called Trinity. And Trinity tells the story through the eyes of an Irish Catholic family from the potato famine right the way through to the start of the Troubles, as it's referred to. By the time I'd finished reading that, I realized that if I had been, by an accident of birth, born into a Catholic sink estate in Londonderry or Belfast, as opposed to being born into the son of a bank clerk in Essex, then I would be doing my level best to kill British soldiers, to revolt against the crown. And that gave me some really valuable perspective. It gave me the opportunity to see through the other person's eyes why I was finding myself in the situations I was finding myself in for the next 4 months, where I always think it's a little unsettling when you realise that somebody's trying to kill you for the first time. It wasn't the last, I hasten to add. And I took that lesson with me, and I've always tried to look for the different perspective. You know, what's missing here? What is this object? What does this challenge look like if you actually, instead of just illuminating it from here, a bit like an objet d'art in a gallery or a museum, what does it look like if you can actually walk around the whole thing and it's illuminated from multiple different directions? So I think that's probably where it stems from. And fast forward or go back at one stage in the professional annual, if you like, to my last tour in Afghanistan. There, the emphasis was still, I was working with the Americans. I was embedded in a 3-star American headquarters. I was the only Brit. And the Americans have got, I think it's fair to say, a pretty laser-like focus on kinetic operations in these situations. The emphasis was very much on taking the fight to the Taliban, and almost everything in terms of the intellectual capacity, the logistic capacity, was being directed down south, as it were, away from Kabul. I was in Kabul with responsibility for training the Afghan army. I was deputy commander of the NATO training mission. And it was not getting the attention it deserved, despite the fact that 14 months later, this was the organization that was going to have to take over responsibility for its own country's security. And I mounted a fairly determined campaign to convince the senior leadership and those politicians that visited that the emphasis was completely skewed, that the emphasis on kinetic operations might have been appropriate 3-4 years beforehand, but now the clock was running down, and if they did not invest in the institutional capacity of their security services, then the country would fail. And I didn't reverse the equation by any stretch of the imagination, but I began to be listened to, and I began to get the support that I needed. Critically, I began to get the individuals with the drive, with the intellectual agility, and the trust of the Afghans to get in and help me to to develop the people in those key positions. So yeah, taking the different perspective, I think, is the key.
And I'm just blown away, metaphorically, of course, with the word at the heart of all of that, which is empathy. And I happened to be on this military course as a civilian guest called RCDS, Royal College of Defence Studies.
Yeah, we both got the dreadful tie, Rob.
One of the things that blew me away was just the amount of empathy that you could find in senior leadership. Not everyone, of course. Some people were totally, devoid, like everybody else in the world. But I think from an outsider's view, to see so much compassion for human beings is not what lay people expect when looking in, for example, on the armed services or the police, which is another massive venture that we've done. And so I think I just want to thank you for that word empathy, which I think runs through all of the stories of social environmental value, and particularly looking at things from so many different angles to look at the causes of why so many people are going into A&E or mental health crises or whatever. So I kind of want to wind now to some of your more recent projects, and I think that some of those involve nature and rewilding and looking at there are so many of them, but just what have you been up to since some of the projects that you've been working on more recently?
So 4 years ago, my consultancy journey took what I can only describe as a slightly less exotic turn. So having enjoyed myself in Nigeria, the Far East, where else did I manage to clock up a few miles, Sub-Saharan Africa and so on and so forth, I got lemoned into going into the Ministry of Defence. And
oh dear.
Yes, yeah, which was a bit of a wake-up call, because this summer I managed to avoid serving him when I was serving. So going in there and being invited to essentially reprofile the Defence's approach to how it accommodates its people, and specifically its families. That was the starting point. And from that, developed the next opportunity, as so often happens. I was approached by Amy, a big facilities management business that at the time had responsibility for maintaining for all 47,000 of the homes in which our service families live in. And that developed into, ironically, me becoming a chief operating officer for the next 2.5 years for Amy's FM business. And as part of that, one of the questions that I was asked was how, as they set about bidding for the next round of accommodation, families housing maintenance contracts, how could they demonstrate a real commitment to social value? Because this had become a statutory part of the contract. PPN 0620, that catchy title, Public Procurement Notice 0620, had come onto the streets. It was now a legal obligation for 10% of the marks of any government contract to be awarded on the basis of the bidder's ability to demonstrate not only an understanding of social value, but a commitment to deliver against it. And the exam question, which Amy put to me, was, A, what does this mean? And B, how can we deliver it in the context of defence housing? And I declined to give them a detailed answer to that on the basis that I had been out of the army by that stage for 5 years. It was another 10 since Susie and I had lived in a defence house, so I wasn't best qualified to speak. But I had recently met the wife of a fellow soldier in my own regiment, Elizabeth, who has a remarkable story of her own, and very briefly, she was a bit of a high flyer in the city, an analyst with an investment bank, and she made the fateful error of meeting and falling in love with a soldier, and found herself 18 months later married. That's the good news. The bad news was she was in Cyprus, so she was out of work, having had to give up her job in the city. Wives in Cyprus have very few opportunities for work because of the status of forces agreement. All the jobs go, perhaps quite rightly, to local civilians. And she was quietly going around the bend, seriously going around the bend, and wasn't ready to start a family, so needed something else to focus her time on. So she took herself back to university and did something she'd always wanted to do, which is a doctorate. Her parents are both academics, and she did a doctorate in sociology using the experience of the militarization of wives and families on their well-being and their mental health. What happens when you rip someone like her, or perhaps worse still, a young girl from an inner city community who marries a soldier and finds herself plonked down behind the wire in Germany or Cyprus or wherever? Has anybody ever actually thought about what that does to them, and the impact on completely rebooting their life in almost every conceivable fashion, taking away their identity, because the army doesn't deal with the wives; they will only deal with the husbands or the spouse. It's his or her signature on the rental agreement. The list goes on. So Elizabeth had some really profound and unique ideas as to what social value could look like in the context of defence families. So I introduced her into Amy, and the net result of that was two things. First of all, the input that she gave that bid team helped them to secure their share of that next contract. They remain responsible for 22,000 married quarters, as we call them, service homes across the central and northern parts of the country. And the business was sufficiently impressed by what she and I had begun to develop as a social value entity that they gave us funding to turn that into two things. First of all, a functioning communities project, which was the business's commitment to social value, which is thriving up in Catterick for the benefit of both the military and, critically, the adjacent civilian community, where, as you alluded to, Rob, we've rewilded or we've repurposed 4 acres of ancient woodland. We've salvaged wetlands in that surrounding area. We've become a carbon capture site through a massive tree planting program, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, we've employed local military spouses to run the project. We have put somewhere in the region of £250,000 into the pockets of service families in wages since the inception of that project. And then as we were doing that, we realised that the sheer quality of the spouses that were being attracted to that cause, we had the opportunity to set up a social value consultancy. And E50K Strategic Advisory, as we've now styled it, is now providing social value analysis, advice, and practical input to defence companies across the strategic supply chain and beyond defence as well. And it is doing really well. And that, again, is giving service spouses the opportunity for paid employment. It is giving them a story to tell in their professional lives, which means that we've actually now begun to see the first of our team members leaving E50K because they've been able to move on to bigger and better jobs by virtue of the fact they've now got a live CV again. Many of these spouses having been, like Elizabeth, either de-skilled when they married into the services, or having to sacrifice their professional development, their professional progression, by virtue of being continually moving around the world. And Susie, my own wife, is a case in point, who sacrificed her teaching career follow me to all points of the compass. So that's a little glimpse of what my social value contribution has been and continues to be more recently.
But it's almost, I mean, it's incredibly moving. It's the tip of the iceberg, though, in terms of the opportunity with social and environmental change projects. That a lot of your contribution is very personal, experiential, first person, how to change the world. And a lot of the so all organisations selling to government, as you say, have this requirement to demonstrate social value outside of the scope of the core contract that they're delivering, as in, we're not, this is not something explicitly we're paying for, but we want this to be additional to what you're doing in the world, and it needs funding, and a lot of it is about how you lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. In other words, help an organisation like Amy or any other organisation in the world, because frankly, everybody organisation wants to make the world a better place. Why wouldn't they? But the capability required is tough, because if you're delivering accommodation as a service contract, that's what you're doing. You're not thinking about regenerating service wives' career or rewilding local landscape. You are delivering accommodation. If you're delivering technology, your job is to deliver desktops into thousands of. So I guess there is a gap that we see in somebody kind of wants the capability without being the journeyman, without actually having to sort of go through, and yet we all have stories, we all have things we can move from. So rather like your stories in Northern Ireland, in Afghanistan, back to the empathy point, do you have any memories about Amy and the capability, and how you kind of got your ideas, Susie's ideas, to survive contact with reality? How did you get them to get it, to drink the water? What was the transformation in terms of, yes, we really need to do this? Was it easy? Was it hard? Were there moments for you in that?
It's been very far from easy, and it's an ongoing process to as you've described there, that inevitable tension between commerciality and doing the right thing. Saving the planet is all very laudable, but it very rarely appears
and
on.
You pay for it,
yeah, precisely, and it very rarely appears on someone's OKRs. So the best way that we have been able to demonstrate to Amy, in this case, the benefit of this has been through their social media impact, their social media profile. It's a sad fact of life that because the provision of service accommodation has been, for time immemorial, such an emotive subject for very understandable reasons, because when you are moving people as frequently as many service families continue to move, despite more permanent basing policies and so on and so forth, having a guarantee of fit, no, more than fit, enjoyable, homes at the far end is so fundamental to their well-being. And because that has not been a great success story over the years, social media has become, inevitably, as it does with everything else in life, it's been a bit of a pressure valve for people to let their frustration show. Well, with the advent of E50K onto the which is the organisation that I was describing, onto the scene in Amy's social values space in the context of housing, that their profile on social media took a significant spike. And what had, and when you strip that back and say, what was it? Was there a particular event? Well, yes, there was. We put forward a proposal for producing a Get You In pack for every family arriving in an Amy maintained house, which is a highly recyclable cardboard box containing a selection of the sort of things that you could really do with when you first move into a new house. A loo roll, a bar of soap from a sustainable source, a company run by a veteran, coffee from a veterans organisation, a game for the children, again on recyclable materials provided by a company owned and run by veterans. The list goes on. So a little box of a bit of a hug in a box, if you like, for that family, and one which demonstrates our connection with the ex-service community's commercial activity. Now that had I use the term loosely, exploded onto the social media scene because it was properly prepared, it was properly released, and so on and so forth. And we pack those boxes in batches of about 4,500 3 times a year in a dirty great warehouse up in Catterick, and that has become a bit of a feeding frenzy for people that want to be associated with what we're doing and who want to get their picture in the local paper and onto Facebook chat nets and so on and so forth. Now that can only be a good thing. So there is social value, direct social benefit in action through something as simple as an 18 by 24 inch cardboard box on someone's kitchen table.
But back to the Nigeria story, back to the Afghanistan story. That there are engagement methodologies. One called asset-based community development. Buzzword, but it's simply your Nigerian oil story. It's essential, and loads of companies are like, how do I get involved with community regeneration, community engagement? If I'm going to build a block of flats, if I'm going to do construction, if I'm going to do employment, how do I do community engagement when, as an organization that delivers housing or technology, I've not done that sort of thing before? So yes, you can have an ex-military wife or 2 in the team, and that is helpful, but sometimes it's necessary, but maybe not sufficient. And it's still possible for it to go really badly wrong. I've got a brilliant love box example that from the NHS, where new members who are being onboarded to the NHS were sent a very small box in no toilet paper in it, but it had a tea bag, and it's like, welcome to the love of the NHS. And there was a tea bag and a coffee sachet and a sugar cube in a box delivered to the house. And it was like, it can backfire as well as it can do all the good that you've just described. So it's easy to think that this community engagement is easy because you've just brilliantly eloquent. Oh, I'll do that, but it's not. It's like any complex program, isn't it? It's not just a matter of, well, who do I pay, how much, and then it's done. So what are the difficulties of doing it right? How do you get a program that is right where you've never done it before? It's a capability you don't have. You don't even know that you're no good at it. It sounds easy. You've made, oh, I'll do that, Richard. Is it that it's my experience, it's really hard to do these things. I don't
Yes,
know.
I mean the E50K experience has told us that there are broadly three types of organisation out there in the context of social value. There are those who know nothing about it and recognise that and put their hand up and say, I need some help here, you know,
Help me.
from first principles. And who we find invariably have actually been doing quite a lot of it already, but didn't realise it, and we help them to capture what they've done already. So they've all, you know, so there's a good news story. If they're putting a bid in, the first call out box is there. You know, this is what we did for the benefit of this community, and so on and so forth. There are other companies at the other end of the spectrum who think they've got this absolutely nailed, and they've got someone who's actually got social value, you know, on a brass sign
The
above
title.
their on their door, and so on and so forth. And when we do, as we spend a lot of our time doing, our sort of desktop analysis of what they're actually doing, it's pretty superficial, and certainly what they've said they were going to do in their previous contract, they are perhaps not doing, perhaps to the sound of the people might have expected. And there's somewhere in the middle. There are those who do understand it, who do have someone allocated to it, but actually say, do you know what? Every situation is different. Every contract is different. Every community that we seek to serve is different. What we really need here is some help in properly understanding the human landscape within which we seek to deliver this particular benefit, and that is another area where we can really help, because it is there's a world of difference between someone in a high-vis jacket with a clipboard and a hard hat going in and asking questions of the community and thinking they're doing community engagement, and actually having some women
Lived experience.
Yep. Some women who have, precisely, walked that journey in the shoes of the people that are going to be on the receiving end, or at the very least, who are nothing to do with the organisations that are going to be delivering this, so can be seen as honest brokers, and who can genuinely go in there and establish, wait for it, empathy with the community that is going to have whatever it might be, a road project, housing maintenance project, whatever, visited upon it, and understanding what is it you would like to see, what's missing here, how could the impact of this be mitigated for you. If there was to be a quid pro quo, what would you like that to be? You know, so instead of a well-meaning contractor putting in 3 more play parks when actually they've got more play parks than they can shake a stick at, what they'd actually really like is some super fast broadband and a coffee shop where busy working mums can go in with the kids and get online for remote working while the children are being amused in a ball pond. That's the sort of level of conversation that needs to be had initially, which doesn't sit comfortably with a project which is going to net, you know, pick a number between 3 and 7 billion over the next 12 years. But it's that can make the difference. That willingness to have that lower level interest and engagement, caring about what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah, and rather interestingly, from a board point of view, a chief exec, a stakeholder, government, that this is not just about the social value project or the environmental value project. It's about how organizations employ people, how they engage with their customers, how they build strategies, to develop their organizations in a time where, we have some issues, whether it's cost of living, whether it's, war in Ukraine, whether it's sustainability, etc. So the complexity is not, is not getting any easier. It's getting more complex. And actually, I just think that empathy word and your characterization of, organizations' self-awareness of that. So we've got product in development, an AI product. You know, it's AI for good that can look at these stories and say, well, where are you as an organization? Where are you as a group of customers, as a, you know, community stakeholders, and where might the gaps be? Because we need to listen more to the stories, which is why this value exchange, you know, looks to just out those stories, which are just so important. And I think I'm going to ask Annabelle for questions. I'm going to look at the time.
Well,
I could do this
I was just going to raise the. I'm
Wow.
conscious of the time, is what we always say at this point. I mean, I don't have any more questions that I want to. I mean, I could talk more and more and more and more forever about what you're doing with social value, and the fact that you've, you know, started in defence and you're going broader. You know, I just feel quite a lot of alignment with you know, the way that you're approaching it, and just as Rob said, the empathy thing. I'm now racking my brain to realise when I realised that I had you know, empathy. When did I learn about that, and when did that first happen in my life? And I don't know when that was, but I feel like, you know, perspectives that matter to me a lot, to the detriment sometimes, because you're like, once you've considered them all, you're like, oh my god, what do you do now? But anyway, so that's a different story. So but just to say thank you, Richard, for your time. If there's anything else you want to raise, how can we help, I guess, is always the last question. How can we help you? Not just us, but anybody who's listening.
What I would personally like is the opportunity to do more of this. E50K, I've thoroughly enjoyed curating over the last 3 years. It is now it's now standing on its own 2 feet. It's demonstrably succeeding. I don't fit into the narrative of E50K. That's the real value of it is the people that it's made up of. I've as I say, I've nurtured it. I've given it shape. I've given it governance. I've given it introductions into a lot of places. So I'm always fascinated by where's the next challenge. Where could I be helping next? So if there was one thing that Ethos might be able to help me with, it might be, you know, just sort of signposting me to where the next challenge could be.
Absolutely going to take you up on that. Yeah, and we're at the next stage of our journey from the beginning of this year, where we've taken the last 12 or 13 ventures, that projects we've been involved with over the years, and we've kind of, you know, we're beyond them, and we're now on to our next great stage of the. So in terms of your personal mentoring, support, advice, we're just at the starting now of this next big one, which always feels like the biggest thing we've ever done. You know, it's like, so it kind of brings that, it's a very scary moment, and we'll follow up and take you up on that very kind offer to support us in our next.
Did I say how could we help you? I think Rob just went.
Yeah.
I think I just said yes,
other.
please.
We should help each other, I think, is what he
absolutely.
means.
And I think that is what it is all about. It's that mutual, you know, support.
Yeah,
but
indeed.
It's always about helping one another. So thank you.
Thank
time
you so
to
much.
just until the next time then, Annabelle.
Yeah.
Richard, thank you very much.